I definitely want to give as many women as possible more tools and resources to handle their own lives financially and to be independent. I think historically it's been very dangerous for women to not have their own money, to not be financially literate, to not be able to protect themselves. A little over 50% of women in, long-term heterosexual relationships, they don't manage their own long-term finances until the case of divorce or death of a spouse.
Welcome to the Millionaire Mentorship Podcast. Today, I've got a very, very special guest. Her name is Chelsea Fagan. She's the author and the CEO of The Financial Diet, helping women talk about money, live a better life on any budget. And she's got 1 million YouTube subscribers, which is no small feat at all. She's an accomplished author, writer, amongst many other things. And I see an excellent cook, living in Manhattan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited about it. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? I was reviewing it, but it comes better from your mouth.
Sure. So I grew up I grew up pretty low income. So although, we never kind of wanted for anything, money was always it was a sensitive subject for me. And when I was in middle school, we moved to a very affluent community. And we were better off than when I was a child. We were more middle class. But I always think to myself and say that being low income with a bunch of other low income kids, you feel normal. But when you go and you're, lower to middle class, around very wealthy kids, you feel way poorer.
Yeah.
And, in that community, not only was I going to high school with kids who would show up in BMWs they got for their 16th birthday. A lot of my friends went to a school that's, 30,000 plus a year for high school. I worked at a yacht club. I was a nanny for very high net worth families. So I was just really exposed to money. And among other things, it really, really created a sense of not just anxiety around money, but inadequacy. So kind of the first thing I did when I turned 18, this was pre 2008 crash just by a hair. So I was, given a credit card. It was a Hello Kitty branded credit card, which I think should be illegal to give to children, basically. I immediately maxed it out on, all of the stuff I wanted and couldn't afford. And I threw it away and I ignored the notices. And my finances really just started spiraling. Was in a ton of credit card debt, was in collections. My license and registration had been suspended from unpaid moving violations. I ended up getting arrested because of that, because they still had to drive to work. And so I just really was in an extremely unhealthy position with money, both literally financially and also emotionally. So when I was 22, I sold my first book and got my first full-time job. And so I was not making a ton of money. My salary was $36,000 a year. The book sold for $22,000. So, on the scale of especially what it costs to live in a big city, it's not humongous money, but it was enough. It was the first time that I had enough that I could, for example, pay off the debt that was in collections and put money into savings. And so I spent a few years sort of just kind of scratching by financially. And then by the time the summer of 2014, so it'll be 10 years ago this year, I really had just decided that I was tired of just kind of not ruining my life financially, that I actually wanted to learn about money and become kind of good with it. So I started a blog called The Financial Diet to hold myself accountable. And because I think I already had a decently sized platform at the time, it really grew very, very quickly. And now, it's a company. We're based out of an office in Manhattan. We're, 9 all women employees. And we make, a ton of different stuff from, like you mentioned, YouTube, but we do events, classes, books, pretty much everything.
That is an awesome story. There's a lot to unpack there. So, I think that there's something to be said about growing up poor, because I grew up poor as well. And when you have that chip on your shoulders, Chelsea, it's like one of those things where you don't know until you get, I had the same thing happen. I went to the nice school, saw the kids with the Acura Integras, and I'm like, and you obviously you're missing out. You got, your Sharon's, whatever, with your 5 siblings in my case. But, I think that puts a chip on your shoulder. I didn't have the same thing where with like the not knowledge of not being able to pay my bills and stuff like that. But I had several instances like that happen to me. So you went into the solution mode. Not a lot of people are going to do that. Like that's going to be a repetitive process most of the time, like where they're just going to continue. Like when somebody gets into debt, they feel like they can never get out of debt and they feel like they can, never get through. So where did you start training your brain in 2014 to kind of look for the solution versus feel like you're in the problem?
Well, I want to just state up front that I was privileged in the sense that I don't have a college degree. I went to a community college, so I didn't have really student debt, which even though the debt that I had was high interest and was in collections and it was, all of these negative things, it was still a relatively small number. So I do want to acknowledge that, for a lot of people who are in six figures plus of debt, it can be, I think, just even really logistically difficult to start chipping away at it. But as far as approaching solutions, my issue with money had always been that I'm a deeply avoidant person, and I still am. When something gives me anxiety or stresses me out, I really tend to avoid it, procrastinate. I would go months without ever looking at my bank account because it stressed me out too much. So publicly holding myself accountable was kind of a way to force myself to confront what I was avoiding. And the first thing I did was just sign up for Mint, RIP, and attach all of my accounts to it so that I just started every day by looking at the numbers. And one of my favorite expressions of all time is what gets measured gets managed, because I really firmly believe that, and the data shows it, that once you start paying attention to the actual numbers, psychologically, you just start wanting to make better decisions, create better habits. And that, I think, applies to everything, but it especially applies to money, because watching the number go up or down, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, can become very addicting very quickly.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And I think that a lot of people do the exact same thing that you're talking about, is they avoid it. Because I had a roommate in my first property that I bought, and he gambled a lot and he made a lot of money, but I never saw him open his mail once. He just, like, he obviously knew he had a gambling problem. I lived with him 2 years. He never opened one piece of mail. And at one point in time, I saw that he had bought something from Sears, and then like 10 minutes later, he had pawned it off at the pawn shop. And I was like, geez Louise, this is crazy. And so but I understand the psychology of, like, it's like getting on the scale, or, any of those types of things that you just really don't want to know about. So you just kind of put yourself to the test and say, I'm going to make this journey. And then that journey became a movement almost. I mean, I would say it's a movement. If you got 1 million subs on YouTube, that's a movement. That's serious. So let's talk. And then
1.1.
yeah, okay, sorry. Over 1 million, 1 million and 1.1 and counting. And
Yes.
that is for those of you guys who are listening right now, that is a huge accomplishment, a huge accomplishment. I don't know what the number is, but there's not a lot of channels over 1 million. And there's a lot of channels out there, but there's not a lot of people that are able to get over 1 million, because it takes serious commitment. It takes a lot of time. Can you talk about what it takes? I'm not anywhere close to you, so I would love to hear it from your perspective.
Well, once again, I do have to disclose the fact that we did have some advantages. We started out, for the first 2 years, our YouTube channel was a production of a company called Complexly, owned by John and Hank Green. They're massive, massive, massive YouTube stars. I think between all of their various endeavors, they probably have 50 million subscribers or more. So we did have that advantage, being a part of their operation. Now, does that mean that you will magically grow your channel? No, absolutely not. There are other channels in their portfolio that are nowhere near the size of ours, and we have been independent for a long time, but it did give us that initial boost. So we did have that advantage. And we also started the channel relatively early, 2015, which was, YouTube was in full swing for sure, but it's definitely harder now than it was then, just because of saturation. But I think for us, the major key, I think, is, and this is something that I see happening all the time, not just in the financial space, but in really any genre or niche that a person is creating content in, is that they really make their content too narrow and too applicable only to people who are really already seeking it out. a lot of times the financial creators that I follow on various social media platforms, their content is very, I mean, it's useful, it's helpful, but it's quite frankly kind of boring and not something that you would just watch for the purpose of entertainment. And I think for any social platform, first and foremost, you have to be offering something compelling and you have to be able to sort of cast a very wide net in order to reach a lot of people. So we really look at the content we create from all of our channels as being sort of a funnel system where, for example, our monthly video essays, which are our big marquee product on YouTube, they do around 3 to 500,000 views on average. They have a very wide audience. They reach a lot of people that we don't normally reach. Those are always something that are really interesting to watch and interesting to click on, regardless of whether or not you're looking for financial advice. And then once you're on our channel, we have a lot of that more kind of nitty gritty content. We have, playlists, courses, things like that for when you want to go a little further into it. But I think first and foremost, you always have to ask, like, is this something that a person who's just kind of walking down the streets of the internet would want to stop and engage with? And I think especially in the more educational spaces, that's not always the case, because I think people put a little too much pressure on themselves to make everything that they create be super strictly adhering to that educational niche.
Yeah, it's a great point you bring up. One thing that I have found is I was trying to chase the broad audience a little bit, and I just could not get passionate enough going off the trending topics, because I just, it's hard when you're not passionate about talking about UPS drivers, and that's a topic that's going on because they just laid off however many thousands of them. You're like, okay. So I was like, you know what? I got to do stuff I'm passionate about because it just shows through the audience, right? But some of my biggest hitters have been stuff that I wasn't passionate about, and it was like, wow, I had one video I did on why you should leave California, and it got 700,000 views or something like that, and I've never had anything close to that. And so it was that kind of got me a little bit, okay, I need to go on the trends. But how do you guys structure your YouTube in terms of like wanting to grow? Do you look at it like from the Mr. Beast standpoint of like thumbnail first and then we're going to start? Or is it like, hey, we have these certain topics that we care about that we're going to put out and they're going to do what they're going to do?
So it's a mix. So for anything that's trending or relevant, it's pretty much always short form video content, because I mean, quite frankly, we have a team that works on these videos, and it's not really realistic to, I mean, we do a 4-day work week, first of all, but even if we didn't, like, I'm not going to call my video editor and be like, spend your entire weekend doing this video so that we can jump on a trending topic. Like, we need to limit that to things that are something that we can kind of produce on the fly. So those typically are short form videos for us, and those really help reach a lot of audience as well. But also, kind of more importantly, I don't generally look at trending video as something I would want to invest in for our longer form content, because it's not very evergreen. Like, a lot of the content will do very well initially, but for us, like, the majority of our views come after that first 30 days. Like, it has a very long lifespan. For us, the approach is very much first and foremost thinking about, what is the topic, what are topics that people are really, really interested in. We look at a lot of data. We think about what we are watching, because we're all, women in the demographic that we're trying to reach. We do care about title and thumbnail for sure, but I think for the most part, it's very much, I mean, we're quite frankly not trying to compete with broad YouTube channels like a Mr. Beast or like these, they cast such a wide net. For us, our audience is 90+% women, young adult women, concentrated in, they're higher earning, they're educated, they're professional. And that is a really, really powerful demographic. And we're more interested in forming more meaningful relationships with our core demographic than reaching the widest audience possible. So I think it's very content driven, subject matter driven. And then also, we're very bullish on, DTC revenue and creating memberships, events, paid events, things like that have always been a big part of our strategy. So, 100,000 views on a video might be nice, but ultimately that's not even worth a fraction of a much smaller number who engage with, the more high touch things that we're putting out.
Good point. So going into like your mission, it seems to empower and help women become financially independent. What is the driving force there? I think that there's a not enough of that out there, to be honest with you. It seems like my audience is 85% male, and most of the people that I know in this space are not women. And I've got a wife, I've got two sisters, I've got a daughter, and I want them to be financially educated. My sister, Chelsea, the same name, she's always, reached to me out to her personal finance, but I think there's a communication gap between men and women, right? Like whether it's your husband, your spouse, or your significant other, your coworker, like sometimes we just talk two different languages, and sometimes you're able to explain things in a much better way to your audience than I would be able to explain that. So can you talk about, how you've affected other lives and why and you've mentioned several times, like all your staff is women. Is that even your editor?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that was purposeful, I'm assuming.
I mean, when your audience is 90+% women, when we put up a job listing, 90+% of our applicants are women. So
yeah, so it makes sense there. So when what's the goal overall for you with the space that you're in?
So it's twofold. One, I definitely want to give as many women as possible more tools and resources to handle their own lives financially and to be independent. I think, historically, it's been very dangerous for women to not have their own money, to not be financially literate, to not be able to protect themselves. And it still happens every day. I mean, it's a little over 50% of women in, long-term heterosexual relationships, they don't manage their own long-term finances until the case of divorce or death of a spouse. So, and that's really scary, right? Like, my childhood best friend, her father passed away extremely suddenly recently, and her mom didn't know any of the passwords. She didn't know where their investments were being held. She didn't know the password of his phone. Logistically managing the finances of that were incredibly overwhelming. And this is a woman who's worked full time her entire life, so that is definitely something. And then, although I'm sure our politics vary radically, I am also very politically motivated. I'm very politically engaged in my own personal life. But also I believe that a lot of the systemic issues that we're talking about when we talk about personal finance, yes, it's important to work on solutions at the individual level, but it's also important to ask ourselves, why are we in this situation? Yes, if you have student debt, we've got to chip away at it, but why are we basically the only developed country where people regularly go into, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt for, basic degrees? Why are we the only country where we're having to pay out of pocket for, vast medical costs when we're the wealthiest country in the world? I think for me, it's also important, for almost all of our content, we try to have both a micro and a macro lens, and to really get people to think about, yes, the first step is, put on your own oxygen mask financially, but then take a step back and ask, well, why are we in this situation in the first place? It doesn't have to be like this.
Yeah. And I think that when it comes to politics, people always say, well, I'm on this side, you're on the other. But I think the reality is that we have a lot more common ground than we agree with. The problem is people pull on people's emotions and they divide us, right? They say, okay, well, I'm for this, you're for that, right? I'm for that, they're for this. If you don't like that, I don't like you. But the reality is we have a lot more common ground. I don't like people, what I'm saying, that like just not me and you, but me and everybody and you and everybody, because I think everybody wants I think everybody knows that our healthcare system is freaking broken, right? Like there's no question that it shouldn't cost me. When my kids went in the NICU when they were born, and we went through my wife did all the research on to make sure we were covered for medical, make sure we were covered for that. We had a $3 million bill because they tried to get us through the back door and saying, well, this is a separate part of our business, And then, we fought it, but I don't think most people without our resources, meaning the business acumen and things like that, it would have bankrupted them. Right. And we were able to get out of that jam. But, the medical world is completely broken. The education system is completely broken. So let's go into it a little bit because I think it's something like, where do you stand? And I know New York City right now, I was watching a few things. I was following the mayoral election out there, Curtis Fluwell versus Eric Adams. I followed that entire situation right now. And I know right now, New York, what's going on in New York and how do you feel about living there and things that have transpired there?
So, I mean, I think it's not a perfect situation by any means, but I think, so my perspective that I come to this with, so I lived in France for several years. My husband's French. We met over there. We spend a lot of time there every year. And so I'm very familiar with a system that, has fairly comparable taxation rates to what I pay here in New York City, but for your tax dollar, you just get so much more. Like you become so used to, you go to the doctor, you don't even think about money. It doesn't cost money. You go to college. I had moved there initially because college is free, and I wasn't even a citizen. I got a visa. You just kind of become used to a much higher level of social resources that you get in exchange for your tax dollars. And, for me personally, one of the things that I'm just consistently very frustrated by is the proportion of my taxes that go to, fighting these never ending wars that no American supports and doesn't help anything and makes the situation worse. I would much rather they go to resources in New York City or wherever you happen to live if I'm paying taxes. The thing about New York is that for me, it's one of the closest places you can get in the US, both as an individual and as a business owner, to that system. So for example, I have a staff of all women. That means there's mothers on my staff. That means we've had multiple women take maternity leave. In the state of New York, our company is reimbursed for 12 weeks, up to 70%. Plus we get another month of disability reimbursement. So we are able to afford a very competitive maternity leave package for our employees because it's so heavily subsidized by the state of New York. That completely varies state to state. And if we were in another state, we would be entirely out of pocket for that exact same maternity leave. Similarly, although it's not always most like if you're riding it on a 110-degree day, 110-degree day in August, it's not the most fun thing in the world to have really comprehensive public transit. I can go visit not just someone in another part of the city, but my friends in Connecticut, New Jersey, Philadelphia, DC, to have that availability. I ride my bike everywhere, to have protected bike lanes on most of the streets. I think that there's a level of social investment here that is higher than other places that I've lived. It's not the only place. I think there are other states that are starting to do it really well. I think Colorado has a lot of really good programs going. But for me, I really judge a place in terms of what do I get back from the tax dollars I'm paying? And I feel like in New York City especially, I get a lot back compared to other places. So overall, while I definitely think there's a lot of room to improve and I'm pretty active in local politics, I feel overall fairly happy.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I didn't know that about New York at all, that they do that maternity reimbursement. I think that's a great idea. The problem with a lot of the taxation, I think that you and I know, is it's like they're always going to say, oh, well, let's do this to do this. Well, we already did that. And and the thing is, like, whether it's we just had the Royals were trying to pass a tax that was already there and they just want to make some changes or whatever. But the reality is once that tax there, it's never going away. It doesn't matter when the stadium's built. Same thing in Vegas where I lived before, the Raiders, it's not going to go away. They're just going to keep the money. And so I think that, and as somebody who's traveled to Europe many times, and we're actually going, me and my wife and my kids are going there, and my wife just sees Taylor Swift. When we're over there and I'm comparing where the US is at right now, and I'm comparing to and I'm like, wow, I've been to Europe a lot over the last 15 years. And I'm like, it's better. Like I look at it, I'm like, as sad as it is for me to say as an American citizen, because I am a true patriot. But when I look at these guys, left or right, lying to your face, and then the only thing they can agree on is banning TikTok. It's like, are you guys out of your freaking mind? It's,
It's very, yeah, it is. And it's also, I mean, obviously there are certain things that I'm just extremely jealous of. Like, for example, the fact that the car lobby in the United States has made it so we'll basically never have efficient train travel. And like, you can go to Europe and get from one country to another for a few dollars on a fast, high speed, clean rail system. Like, we could have that. China has it. Like, why do we not have it? There's obviously things like that that are very frustrating.
We have the train tracks.
We have the train tracks. But I think the other thing that is really important to look at, in terms of, because some of it is very logistical, but also when you look at things like the long-term health outcomes and how people age and their overall reported levels of happiness. I'm sure when you go to Europe, you'll notice that, like, in the evenings, people of all ages gather in the town square and they, take long walks and they eat together. And there's just a level of community. I think that is the real concept that is missing in a lot of American life is, we have a concept of communities based on certain things. You might have a community with your church or, a specific aspect of your life. But for the most part, I feel like most Americans don't really look around and think that the people that they pass by every day are truly members of their own community.
Yeah, I think the patrioticness of America has gone by because the people just don't trust the politicians that they elected. And it's a lot of telling you nice things, a lot of like, you can look at anything, but it's like almost like YouTube for politics, because it's like clickbait. Like, we'll call it the Inflation Reduction Act, but it has nothing to do with inflation, nothing to do with reduction, or we'll call it the CARES Act, but it has nothing to do with that. There's all these secret gems that nobody read because the name was good and it sounded good. And then they passed it and it either helped special interest groups, lined other people's pockets, and things that I think that we could probably agree on are like term limits. Why would you have these people in these offices for 40, 50 freaking years? Get them in and get them out. And that's the end of the deal. Because if you are Nancy Pelosi and you went into politics 50 freaking years ago and you're worth 400 million, $500 million, that's not right. You know what I mean? You went in to be a public servant.
I agree. Also, I normally 99% of the time think that we're too ageist as a society, except for politics. Why are all of our options people who are borderline senile? I watch these debates and I feel really anxious because I'm like, I just hope no one passes out on stage or forgets what they're saying mid-sentence. Like, it's very uncomfortable to see, and especially when you consider, how old the average population is. Like, we need to, like, the fact that there's not even just no representation for young people, there's not even representation for middle-aged people. The only people who are at high levels running things are older than my grandparents in some cases. And I do think that is really something that we need to unpack as a society. And part of it is, I totally agree, term limits would be a huge part of it. But also part of it is, I think for me, I do like to be involved. I don't plan to run for office personally, but I do like to be involved in a lot of different ways. And I personally have always felt, if you're online yelling at each other about political stuff, you need to, in order to have the right to do that, you need to do X many hours of actual volunteering, actual phone banking, showing up to community board meetings, because the part of the problem is that young people, even people with, passionate opinions, they don't show up, they don't vote, they don't run for office, they don't get involved.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that I think it's important that if you care, get involved. And the other big thing is, like, as a guy who has donated across the aisle to many different politicians, I can tell you, like, I'm like, okay, cool. I think, I'm going to go over there and they're going to want to hear what I got to say. Like, no, they don't care. Like, somebody wrote a bigger check and, it's like, whatever. And the problem, I think, is the corporations. We can all agree. It's not like the corporations are running the country. The big corporations are running the country. And if we look at that, like, we compare it to France, they don't poison their people. Like, our food system drives me absolutely freaking bonkers. The fact that we got our enemy Russia over here who has banned GMO, genetically modified food, right? It's like, it drives me crazy that to go in and to make a good choice for my family, I can't, because unless I decide to go off the grid and raise my own cattle, raise my own food, I can't. Like, it's virtually impossible to go to the grocery store and not pick one of the big corporations that control sunscreen, that and everything that is being spread out there is a complete lie. So I think we're on the same page on a lot of things. We might vote a little bit differently, but I think we're probably going for the same objective. I wanted to get back to you as an author and a writer, because I don't want to get too deep into politics, because I think that you're passionate. I think that you're coming from the same way I'm coming from. You just want a better society for the future generation, which is exactly what I want. I wanted to get into your writing and how that started.
I've just really written my whole life. I write, it's a lot of what I do. I mean, even the scripts that we do for YouTube, it's a lot of writing. I have written several books now. I have 2 coming out next year in different genres. And it's just a personal passion. I've always loved it. And I've always found also that, especially in, I think a lot of social media and online communication is really pushing us toward faster, catchier, less nuance, less understanding. And I think especially writing books, writing long form essays or even newsletters, I think there's something really nice about taking time to spell out your ideas and really thinking and editing and going back and reconsidering things. I don't know. I think it's just a really nice way. It's the same reason I think a lot of people, I mean, although we like to say that we don't read, actually people buy more books than ever and people are reading more than ever before. And I think part of that is the same thing. People want that slow, thoughtful way of communicating.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote my first book just to do as a giveaway, but then I found that I didn't put a lot of thought in it that way. And when I finally got the product, I was like, no, there's no storytelling here. It's just a recipe.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to like it because there's no story. And so I rewrote the whole dang thing. And then I actually enjoyed the process after it was done, even though it took me a long time. But I think, and I'm working on one right now, and that one is just like, okay, whenever I get a good thought, go in, write it down, and then just kind of take that through that journey. What's your writing style like? How do you kind of decide hey, I'm going to write a book about this, or I'm going to write a book about that? How do you come up with those decisions?
It totally depends. I typically now do a kind of mix of traditional and self-publishing for financial and creative reasons. So I write romance novels and I publish those under my own imprint because I like to have creative control and keep the money, frankly, because the royalties in trade paperback are terrible. Yeah. So in that case, I have a team that I work with, contractors for, editing, marketing. I work with a painter who does oil paintings for the covers, things like that. So in those cases, I just sort of approach it as a purely creative exercise. And I, brainstorm, get inspiration, and really take it kind of at my own pace. And then for my nonfiction work, like the financial books I've done, I have a book coming out next year with Penguin that's about hosting and entertaining. Those are more, I try to be strategic with how I use social media, because for those types of books, you can negotiate pretty good advances and pretty good royalty structures. So it makes sense to work with the trad publishers. So I really try in those cases to think a little bit less creatively and a little bit more strategically in terms of what I think will sell, what I think there's a real interest for, what I think I can create a good funnel for in the content that I create. And then I've worked with the same agent for 13 years now. So we work together to sell it. And then as far as the writing itself, I write very, very quickly. Like this manuscript I'm working on for the hosting book, I will easily do 5,000 words a day, and I write it very, very quickly.
Wow, that's awesome. That's super cool. I want to talk you because, like I said, my sister's name is Chelsea. Her favorite author, and I remember this, and I wasn't a reader growing up, but my sister was a ferocious reader, and especially when she got into romance novels. And Danielle Steele, I remember, was her go-to romance novel. Now, when you're writing a romance novel, I follow a lady out of New York who's got a great out of California, who's got a great podcast. It's called Sex with Emily. Okay. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a fantastic, she does a great job with it. And it's just talking very organically about what most people are going through in couples or whatever the situation, but she does a great job. But when you're writing those romance books, are they is that storytelling? Is that fantasy, or what is that all about?
I mean, so let's be very clear. I work with financial services companies. They're rather chaste. They're not, anything really provocative. But they're, I mean, they're novels. I think for me, I have always found, I've only published one so far, and the next one is coming out next year. I'm working with the same team. I personally think that a lot of the, women's chick lit that's out there, because it's often, romance and similar genres, genre fiction in general, romance, sci-fi, mystery, or they're in a different part of the bookstore. They're not released in hardcover. They're released in what's called trade paperback. The deals aren't very good. It's kind of treated as, not very serious. It's not treated with the same level of care in a lot of cases that more sort of what's the word I'm looking for? More valorized fiction titles are. So there are really two categories that sort of exist in parallel. There's women's contemporary fiction and there's romance. And so I like to write books that I think sort of exist between the two. And part of the reason why I initially decided to do it by myself was because the first few conversations that I had with editors, they were very clear that I would have to make certain structural changes so that the book would be truly considered one genre or the other. And I personally like reading books that kind of toe the line between both. And so that's kind of the books that I do, but they're not, I can assure you that my mother reads them. They're very chaste.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I just was curious about them, you know what I mean, in terms of what you're putting in them and everything like that. This has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate, number one, you being like vulnerable and talking about your past. Number two, you sharing what you're doing right now. For women who are listening right now, because that's who I want to speak to on this podcast. For women who are listening and they're like, maybe they're uncertain about their future. Maybe they're like you in the beginning and they just are financially not sound and they want what you got. Like my sister, I'll say, she wants what you're doing. What would you, and she's not going to listen to her brother. I promise you that. Those messages I've had. What would you tell those women at a young age, maybe older or wherever they're at in their life, to how to become financially free, how to make those changes that you did?
Well, so I don't want children, so that helps. That helps with time. That helps with money. That gives me a lot more freedom. But I think first and foremost, one of the mistakes that women make when it comes to setting themselves up financially, professionally, creatively, is not having very, very firm boundaries. We know statistically that more and more as women enter the workforce, they really enter a very lose-lose situation in the home, especially when they have children, where they're not only now working full-time, but they also statistically take on the majority of childcare, the majority of domestic labor. They're essentially having to fulfill both roles. And, we come from a model where we had generally one working parent, one stay-at-home parent, and families were able to get by on one income. We now have created a paradigm where women are not only encouraged to enter the workforce, but most cases required to enter the workforce. But we haven't had the same revolution for bringing men into the home. So there is I think, a very frequent occurrence that women, because we're raised to take care of others, because we're raised to say yes, and we're raised to put ourselves on the back burner. So many women that I know personally, that I have in my family, that I've known throughout my work, they sort of wake up one day and they realize that not only do they not have, oftentimes, like I mentioned, they don't even know the passwords to their bank accounts. They don't, they are completely overworked in their job and completely overworked at home. They've really lost touch with their spouse. They've lost touch with themselves. So I think first and foremost is, and maybe you need therapy to do this. Maybe you need, to have an accountability group to do this. We have a lot of, what our community does is create accountability groups, is learn to have a very clear relationship with your own inner voice and your own sense of what you do and don't want in life. and become comfortable with saying no, become comfortable with saying, I can't take that on. In the case of, for example, having to take on so much of the domestic labor at home, a very common dynamic is that women will just do things preemptively, and then get frustrated that other people aren't doing them. So I think,
You're talking to my
having
wife.
that, I mean, it's very common. I
Yeah.
think so. Having that really strong sense of your limitations really opens up a much clearer pathway to not only doing what you're interested in professionally and personally, but also taking ownership of your finances, because you have the mental bandwidth to become interested in it.
So what I heard was take less of the load that you feel like society has put you in and start focusing on yourself a little bit more versus trying to be almost a people pleaser to everybody based on the way society's. Is that accurate, or am I misinterpreting that?
Well, and also make sure that you're signing up for a fair deal. I think women in hetero relationships today, that statistically often, people in LGBT relationships report higher levels of happiness and satisfaction. I think in part because it's kind of hard in a lot of cases for them to get together. So, when they really find each other and they're happy, that's a much more active choice. But I think also part of it is because there's not these really outdated gender norms that slot people into these positions that are no longer really supported by society. So, for example, if you're a woman coming into a hetero marriage and you're working full time and expected to contribute full time to the household financially, then that household work better be 50-50 too, and a real 50-50, and if you want me to be taking primary care of the kids, primary care of the house, you better be paying the bills, or vice versa. I have many friends, I think, being in the personal finance space, I know many couples where the woman is the breadwinner of the household and the father is the primary parent. And I think that's an awesome setup too. But I think, again, so often women end up in this situation that's really the worst of both worlds. And before they even realize it, they wake up and they're in the middle of their lives and they don't have much control over anything.
I don't disagree with you at all with what you said. And I think that it speaks to my childhood. My mom raised me, it speaks to a lot of people's childhood. Like I was exchanging DMs with one of the Kansas City Chiefs the other day, trying to get him on the podcast as well. And I was looking at his thing, and he said his name's Isaiah Pacheco. He's a monster. And he was like, two of his brothers died, and I think he grew up in New York, and he's like, this is all about my mom. My mom raised me. My mom did everything. And there's many stories about that. I just have one question. It may be personal. You may not want to answer it, but you did mention it, so I'm going to bring it up. You seem like
Sure.
you'd be such a great mother, and you have so much to offer.
Oh.
And I've heard so many people say that. And then like 3 years later, I see them, they have children. So have you ruled it out completely, or is it just something at this point in time that you don't want children? Or why did you come up with that decision?
Boy, I would be a terrible mother. I would be a terrible mother. I'm very good at very many things, but I know the kind of mother the kind of parents that I had and what they were willing and able to do for me. And I would not be willing or able to do these things for people. I have a lot of children in my life. My sister is 28, about to have her third child. She lives on a farm. We are surrounded by children. I do some volunteer work with organizations here in the city. I love children, but I also think, this is something I talk about very openly because I do think it's a real societal issue. Aside from the fact that there are, for example, in New York City at any given time, almost 10,000 children in the foster system at any given time in just one city. Even for children who don't end up in that place, there are a lot of bad parents out there. There are a lot of neglectful, abusive, not ready to be parents, not ready to take on that responsibility. And I think I speak a lot about my late grandmother, who she was a wonderful grandmother. But if you speak to any of her kids, she was not a good mother.
Oh, yeah.
And I think about so many of the qualities she had, so much of what she had to offer, the way that she was able to interact with me as her granddaughter. And I think this is a great example of a woman who would have been great at so many things, but because she was Catholic in the 60s, she had 5 kids. And that's just what she did. And her
Yeah.
whole life, you could tell, I mean, they didn't really have the language for it, but that was clearly not the right choice for her. And I think, could I have a kid and make it work? Sure. Do I want them? No. And more importantly, I think society is in dire need of more people who are interested in being in the lives of children outside of just their own, because all around us at all times, there are so many children who are already here who need people in their lives to care about them and don't have them.
Yeah, no, I agree. My sister, again, she adopted a child, and that's why I said, like, there's a lot of common ground there. I'm gonna hit her up and say, you need to check out this one for sure. She's gonna love it. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being super vulnerable and telling us all that. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we let you go?
Oh, it's not vulnerable at all. I'm a woman talking to women, and we talk about these things 24/7. This is second nature to me.
Yeah, I know. I just, when people are when people are so open with me, I just appreciate it, because there's so many people that are just guarded and unwilling to talk about.
It's true.
But yeah, they're just, even, they're going to have their platform, and they're going to say, well, I'm this, and just, you can only see that. But I think, the best way to connect with somebody is to let down your defenses. Like, when I don't like flying, and whenever I'm on a plane, I'm like, if I'm nervous, I'll tell the guy next to me, yeah, I hate flying. And all of a sudden it's like that relief just comes over you. You're like, okay, cool. He understands, or we're a human being and stuff like that. So I really just appreciate you being open, I guess is the better word for it. So,
well, thank you.
how do people follow your journey? How do they get a hold of you? How do they learn more about you? How do they buy your books?
Search The Financial Diet. We're on most platforms. I am also I'm on TikTok and Instagram personally. It's mostly just like food and hosting and entertaining content, but you can find me there at Fagan Chelsea. And yeah.
Awesome. Last question, and I promise it's the last one. You're a foodie. What is the dish that I got to try at home right now? What would you recommend? We're really cooking a lot of stuff at home these days. I saw one of your soups, and I was like, ooh, because I'm a soup guy. I saw one of your soups, and I was like, okay, I got to ask her something.
Oh, well, thank you. If you like soups, would you like curries, like Indian food at all?
I love me some curry.
Okay, so I have been finally getting into cooking Indian food for the first time. I was always very intimidated by it, but it's actually a lot easier than I thought. And there's a really good cookbook that I've been working from called Masala. Very easy to follow, and it kind of like teaches you all about India and the spices and all that stuff. So I highly recommend trying a curry if you haven't before.
Awesome. I'll check it out. Yeah, I actually am a yogi, if you wouldn't believe that or not.
I love that.
Yeah, that happened organically. Like it happened crazily, but it was just, I needed to do it. So I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing your story. And guys, make sure you give, and women, make sure you give her a 5-star review, and make sure you give her a follow. Check her out. She's got a lot to offer. And I hope to see you again soon, maybe in person.
Maybe in person. I would love that.
Did you ever want to invest in real estate? Did you ever want to live the life of your dreams? Did you want financial freedom? We have a free Facebook group, the Millionaire Mentorship Facebook group for real estate investing. Make sure you join. The link is in the description. If you want to schedule a free call with me and my team, and you actually want to start, I would suggest you do so. We have helped hundreds of people change their lives, and all they had to do was get started. They booked a call with me and my team, and they got the ball rolling. And I'm so confident that if you don't get your first or next investment property within the first 90 days, you don't pay, and I'll give you $1,000 cash. That's how confident I am. Obviously, you got to take action. You can't just do nothing and expect that to happen, but that's life. Life's all about taking action.